so our first step is going to be to remove the battery. So we have an 8mm ratcheting wrench here, or you can use the socket. So we're going to remove this one here for the negative side. Move that out of the way. Then we're going to come over to the driver's side, and we went ahead and broke that loose. So now we can remove this terminal. Move it out of the way. After that, there's a 15mm nut we have to take off for the top motor mount bolt. And so I'm using a 15mm ratcheting wrench here. Once again, these aftermarket headers are getting in the way, because usually you can just get a ratcheting wrench with an extension straight down on that, but with these in the way I had to use this. But anyway, we're going to remove the top 15mm nut on each side for the motor mounts. Okay, next we lifted the car up into the air, and so we supported it on jack stands right here on the support beam. That's where we lifted with the jack. And so we have our jack stands on each side there, and that's going to be giving us enough space to work up in the front. Now for the engine support bar, I really like using the alternator holes to lift on to really support the engine. It's a good spot. So we're going to remove the alternator. So we have to get the tension off the belt. So we put our 1/2" drive wrench in here. A breaker bar works better if you can fit one at that particular angle, but it's nice to ratchet too. And you're just going to push down on this, which is going to release tension on the belt. So on one of these smooth pulleys, just pull the belt out from under it, and that way we can get it off of the top of the alternator. Okay, now we're going to remove the 2 lower alternator bolts here. Next, you want to unplug the alternator connector here. So you just put a screwdriver in there and press inward, and then you'll pull the plug right off. So just apply pressure there and you can pull it right out. Now you can lift the alternator forward and get to the connector that's on the back. Okay, now you're just going to remove this boot here to expose this 10mm nut. So you take that off. And now you can lift this. We're just lifting this off of the post. Okay, you can put the nut back on there so it doesn't get lost. And now just lift the alternator out. Okay, so we have our engine support bar in place. We have the feet over here in the fender well, and that's on each side. Then we have our handle here. We're grabbing our chains, and they're both going through the alternator holes there. So we had other alternator bolts. You could probably use your stock hardware, but I like these because they had longer threads. So this bolt is going all the way in to where the alternator mounts on both sides here. So now we can support the engine this way, and as we lift up on the bottom of the engine on the oil pan, this will support the engine from above. On these chains, you do want to make sure that you have the same amount of links going down on both sides so that it will lift evenly. Okay, now from underneath the car we're going to get these power steering lines out of the way, and there might be a sway bar that's missing on this car that you'd have to disconnect as well. So I just took out the 8mm bolt there, put it back in its place when I was done for that bracket. Now I'm removing this one over here so it comes down from the top. I'm going to remove that one, and then we should be able to push these lines out of our way. Okay, so we've put a block of wood on our jack, and we're lifting on the very front of the oil pan. Okay, the wood's going to help distribute the load so you don't dent your oil pan. And so as we're lifting here, you can see the engine start to raise. Okay, so as it raises, we're going to support it and just keep bringing this, tightening this to increase the tension on that. And that way we're going to be able to support the engine and lift it off of the motor mounts. Okay, so I'm going to let the jack do the heavy lifting. So as these start as these start to get loose from lifting with the jack, then I'm going to come up here and spin this to tighten it down. It's probably not a good idea to crank this in order to lift the engine, so let the jack do the heavy lifting, get that pushed up, tighten this back down to put the tension back on the chains, and just keep doing that process till you have enough clearance. Okay, and so we want to lift until the stud that's coming out of basically the frame of the car clears that motor mount. Next we can just take off the motor mount bolts and remove the motor mount. Okay, so we have all of these other 3 bolts out. We're just removing our last motor mount bolt. This one's even a different size. These should be 13s. Somebody else had to find another bolt, it looked like. So as long as we've cleared our stud, it'll come right out. Now the passenger side's the same way. You want to make sure you're clearing that stud. That's why we had to lift the engine, and then you're undoing these 13mm bolts. However, over here you do have an engine ground, so you just have to take that nut off first, remove the black cable, which is the the engine ground, and then remove the stud after that. Okay, so I had to take that nut off. The problem I was having is that nut was on tighter than this stud, so when I tried to move the actual nut off, the whole thing would spin. And so I had to use an impact, and that was fast enough to get it off. So now you can just slide the ground off, and you'll need a deep socket 13 now to get off this one, and the other one up here is also a stud, so that'll require the deep socket 13. Okay, so you can pull your motor mounts out now. And once again, that's the stud that they go on, and that's where the actual rubber mount part is that gives you the insulation to make it smooth. And I went under and put the motor mount back on. On the passenger side, everything's good. I got everything tight, so I was able to put the motor mount bolts back in. Those were 13mm, and then you had the 13mm stud, and then I put the ground wire back on, and then the 15mm nut that went over it to hold the ground wire on. Okay, and as you can see, we're not lining up over here on the motor mount just because the engine's floating in the air from the top support. So we're gonna have to guide that into its spot. So the motor mount's back into place. It was the 13mm bolts, except for it had a different size one. Now I'm just going to line it back up on this side and line it back up on that side and lower the engine. Okay, so now we're going to slowly let the engine down, and we want it to line up into those studs for the motor mounts. So we are going to have to kind of rock the engine towards the driver's side, is what we're seeing right now. And you want those to line up, and just drop it down until it goes in. Okay, so we got it to line up on the motor mounts there. And so they're back in with the 15mm nut back on top, both sides. Had my neighbor come over, and with a pry bar we just got in there and kind of moved it around. We did find out that the actual stud itself you can kind of pry on, and it will move a little bit, and that was what we were able to do to kind of get it into those holes and just kind of pry it into its spot, and then we just slowly let it down. So hopefully that doesn't give